In the autumn of 2021, a man named Marcus Bell stood inside a collapsing barn in rural Georgia and made himself a promise. He had $92 to his name, a duffel bag of secondhand tools, and absolutely nowhere else to go. The roof above him was caving in. Half the wooden beams were soft with rot. A family of raccoons had claimed the hayloft, and the smell of old hay and mildew was so thick he could taste it on the back of his tongue. But Marcus looked around that rotting structure and saw something that nobody else would have seen. He saw a home. What he built over the next 4 months, hidden behind those weathered walls, is one of the most resourceful survival stories you will ever hear. And for almost 2 years, not a single person knew he was there. This is the story of how a man with nothing turned a forgotten barn into a secret house for less than $100, and how that barn saved his life. To understand how Marcus ended up in that barn, you have to go back to the spring of 2021, to a small industrial town about 2 hours south of Atlanta. Marcus was 43 years old. He worked the night shift at a paper mill, the kind of place his father had worked before him and his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Bells had punched the same clock. Marcus had his own 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. He drove a 1998 pickup truck that he kept running through sheer force of will. He wasn't rich, he wasn't even comfortable, but he had a routine and he had a roof, and for most of his adult life, that had been enough. Then the letter came. The mill was closing. Corporate had made the decision 3 states away, in a boardroom Marcus would never see. They offered severance, but the severance barely covered 1 month of rent. They offered a job retraining program, but the retraining program was for a facility 400 miles away that Marcus couldn't afford to move to. Within 6 weeks, the mill was gone. The parking lot where he used to eat his lunch out of a metal tin box was empty, and Marcus was looking at an eviction notice taped to his apartment door. He tried everything at first. He applied for 40 different jobs in 6 weeks. He sold his furniture on Craigslist, piece by piece. He sold the pickup truck to a man in town for $1,800 in cash, and he watched it drive away, feeling like a part of his own body had gone with it. When the eviction finally came, he put everything he owned into a small storage unit on the edge of town and caught a bus to Atlanta, because Atlanta was where the work was supposed to be. Atlanta was not where the work was. For the next 6 months, Marcus slept in shelters when he could find a bed, and on benches when he couldn't. He learned which park rangers would leave you alone if you were gone by sunrise. He learned which fast food restaurants would let you sit in a booth for 2 hours if you bought a coffee. He applied for jobs at construction sites, at warehouses, at loading docks. Some of them called him back. Most of them didn't. The ones that did wanted an address, and he didn't have one. He stopped being able to pay for the storage unit, and everything he owned, the photo of his mother, his high school diploma, the watch his father had given him when he turned 18, got auctioned off to strangers. By the time winter started to set in, Marcus had made a decision. Atlanta was killing him. The city was too expensive, too cold, too crowded, and too full of other men who had the same desperate look in their eyes that he was starting to see in the bathroom mirror. He had one idea left. He remembered, as a child, driving with his grandfather through the back roads of rural Georgia, past abandoned farms and empty fields. His grandfather had told him that the whole countryside was full of forgotten places, barns nobody used anymore, sheds nobody maintained, whole farms where the owners had died and the heirs had moved away and nobody had set foot on the land in years. Marcus took the last $40 he had to his name, bought a bus ticket to a small town about 90 miles southeast of Atlanta, and started walking. He walked for 3 days. He slept in a ditch the first night, under an overpass the second, and in the woods behind a gas station the third. On the morning of the fourth day, walking down a dirt road lined with pine trees and tall grass, he saw it. Set back from the road, maybe a quarter mile through an overgrown field, was a structure. The roof was sagging. The wood was gray with age. Kudzu vines had crawled halfway up one side of the wall. There was no house anywhere in sight. No car tracks, no fence. Just the barn, sitting alone in a field that had not been mowed in what looked like a decade. Marcus walked toward it slowly. He expected, at any moment, for someone to shout at him. A farmer, a dog, a police car. But there was nothing. Just the sound of his own boots in the grass and the wind moving through the pine trees. When he finally reached the barn, he stood outside the big sliding door for a full minute before he worked up the courage to push it open. Inside, it was worse than he had hoped and better than he had feared. The roof had collapsed on one side, leaving a jagged hole the size of a car. The floor was dirt, packed hard from decades of use. There were old hay bales turning into dust in the corners. A rusted tractor part sat in the middle of the main space, half buried. Bird droppings streaked the walls. The whole place smelled like damp wood and animal, but it was dry in most places. The walls were standing. The main frame was still sound. And most importantly, Marcus realized as he walked the perimeter, there was absolutely no sign that anyone had been here in a very, very long time. He spent that first night just inside the door, wrapped in a thin blanket he had pulled from a donation box in Atlanta, listening to mice in the walls and trying not to think about the cold. Around 3 a.m, staring up at the broken roof and the stars he could see through the hole, Marcus had the thought that would change everything. What if he did not just sleep here for a night? What if he stayed? What if he made this place livable? He had nothing. He had no tools, no materials, no money to speak of, but he had time and he had his hands. And he had a roof, however broken it was, over his head. The next morning, he walked 3 miles back to the nearest town, found the hardware store, and laid his $92 on the counter. This is where the story gets interesting, because what Marcus bought that day and what he did not buy became the blueprint for everything that followed. He did not buy new lumber. He did not buy insulation. He did not buy any of the things a normal person building a home would buy. He bought a cheap blue tarp for $11. He bought a box of galvanized nails for $6. He bought a roll of heavy-duty duct tape for $4. He bought a handsaw, used, from the clearance bin for $8. He bought a bag of concrete patch for $7. And he bought a secondhand claw hammer from a wooden crate near the register for $3. That was his entire starting kit, $39. He kept the rest of the money folded in his pocket for emergencies. Then he walked the 3 miles back to the barn and started working. The first problem was the roof. The collapsed section was letting in rain, and rain was the enemy of everything. Marcus climbed up into the hayloft, picked his way across the rotten beams, and studied the hole from underneath. He realized that if he could anchor the blue ship across the interior of the roof, stretched tight between the sound beams, he would create a kind of hidden ceiling. From the outside, the hole would still look like a hole. Birds could still fly in and out. Rain would still fall through. But below the tarp, in the main space of the barn, everything would stay dry. It was a brilliant piece of thinking because it meant he did not have to fix the outside of the barn at all. He could leave the exterior looking exactly as abandoned as it had always looked. The repair would be invisible. It took him 2 days. working in the cold with frozen fingers to get the tarp strung up the way he wanted it. He used the salvaged nails, some old wire he found coiled in a corner of the barn, and the duct tape to seal every edge. When a storm rolled through on the third night, Marcus sat on the dirt floor below his hidden ceiling and watched rain pour through the hole in the roof, hit the tarp, and run off to the sides exactly where he had planned for it to run. For the first time in over 6 months, he slept completely dry. The next problem was the walls. 3 of the 4 walls were in reasonable shape. The 4th had 2 large gaps where boards had rotted out and fallen away. Marcus started walking the property in wider and wider circles, looking for anything salvageable. What he found was a gold mine. Behind the barn, in a tangle of weeds, was a pile of old lumber that had been stacked there and forgotten. Some of it was rotten, most of it was still usable. He found a broken-down wagon with oak planks he could pry loose. He found an old chicken coop that had partially collapsed, and its walls gave him enough reclaimed boards to patch every hole in the barn 3 times over. None of it cost him a single dollar. All of it had been sitting there for years, waiting for someone to see it the way he saw it. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus patched every gap in the walls. He used his secondhand handsaw to cut the salvage boards to size. He nailed them into place with the galvanized nails he had bought at the hardware store. Where the joints did not quite meet, he filled them with handfuls of dirt mixed with the concrete patch, pressing it into the cracks with his bare fingers until it set hard. When he was finished, the inside of the barn was still rough and still ugly. But it was sealed. Wind could not get through. Water could not get through. And from the outside, looking across the field from the dirt road, the barn still looked exactly as abandoned and exactly as collapsed as it always had. That was the genius of what Marcus was doing. He wasn't fixing the barn. He was hiding inside of it. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. People who built something out of nothing in places nobody was looking. Now, let's get back to Marcus, because the inside of the barn was about to become something nobody who saw it from the outside would ever believe. By the end of the first month, Marcus had a sealed shelter, but a sealed shelter is not a home. A home has a place to sleep, a place to sit, a place to keep your things, and some small amount of dignity. Marcus had none of those things yet, so he started building them one at a time out of whatever the land around him provided. For a bedi, he gathered armloads of the old hay that had been turning to dust in the corners of the barn. He dried it in the sun outside for 2 days to kill the mildew and piled it into a rectangular frame he built out of scrap lumber. He found an old canvas tarp in the wagon, washed it in a creek about a quarter mile away, and laid it over the hay as a kind of fitted sheet. The blanket from the Atlanta donation box went on top. It was not a mattress. But the first night he slept on it, he said later, was the best sleep he had had in almost a year. For furniture, he walked the property. Behind the old chicken coop, he found 3 wooden crates, the kind farmers use for shipping apples. He dragged them back to the barn, cleaned them, and arranged them into a small sitting area near the spot he had chosen as his living space. 1 crate became a table, another became a stool, the 3rd he turned on its side and used as shelving for the few small possessions he had: a tin cup, a pocket knife, a paperback book he had carried with him from Atlanta, and the folded remainder of his cash. For light, he had a problem. Any kind of fire or flame at night would glow through the cracks in the walls and give him away. So Marcus only allowed himself to work inside the barn during daylight hours, using the light that came through the doorway. At night, he sat in total darkness, listening to the sounds of the countryside, and slept. He told himself it was like being a sailor on an old ship. You worked when the sun was up, and you rested when it was down. After a few weeks, his body adjusted, and he stopped noticing the darkness at all. The hardest thing to solve was warmth. Winter was coming hard, and the barn, even sealed, was cold. Marcus studied the problem for days. He knew he couldn't run a stove. Smoke would give him away instantly. A chimney coming out of an abandoned barn would be seen from miles away. So instead, he built what he called his cold weather nest. In the far corner of the barn, against the warmest wall, he constructed a small enclosed space out of the salvaged lumber. It was about the size of a closet, just big enough to crawl into and lie down. Inside, he lined the walls with more hay, packed tight, and on top of that, he layered every piece of cloth and blanket he could find on the property, including an old feed sack he discovered in the loft. When he climbed into that nest at night and pulled the opening shut behind him, his own body heat, trapped inside the insulation, kept the space warm enough to survive even the coldest Georgia night. It wasn't comfortable, but it worked. By the end of the second month, Marcus had done something remarkable. He had turned a rotting barn into a functioning, completely hidden home. He had a bed. He had a sitting area. He had shelves. He had a cold weather nest for the worst nights. He had a water source in the creek a quarter-mile away. He had spent total about $67 of his original $92. And from the outside, anyone who drove past the field on that dirt road would see exactly the same thing they had always seen: a collapsing barn in a forgotten field. Nothing more. But the story doesn't end there, because staying hidden was its own kind of work, and Marcus almost got caught more than once. The first close call came in early winter. Marcus was sitting on his crate, reading his paperback in the thin light coming through the barn door, when he heard voices, men's voices, laughing, coming closer. He froze. He set the book down very slowly and crawled into the cold weather nest, pulling the opening shut behind him. Through a gap in the boards, he could see two men walking across the field toward the barn. They had rifles slung over their shoulders. Hunters. They walked right up to the barn door, stood there for a minute talking about deer tracks, and then one of them actually pushed the door open and looked inside. Marcus held his breath. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The man stood in the doorway, scanning the interior, looking at the dirt floor, the hay, the rusted tractor part. He did not see Marcus's bed because Marcus had learned to cover it with loose hay every morning. He did not see the furniture because Marcus had arranged it to look like random junk from a distance. He did not see the patched walls because the patches were on the inside and the inside was dim. After about 20 seconds, the hunter turned to his friend and said loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly that there was nothing in there but rats, and that the place was going to fall down by spring. Then they closed the door and walked away. Marcus stayed in the nest for another 2 hours before he trusted the silence enough to come out. The second close call was worse. It came in the early spring, about 6 months into his stay. Marcus was outside the barn hauling creek water back in an old plastic jug when he saw a pickup truck stopped on the dirt road. A woman was standing next to it, looking directly at the barn. Looking, Marcus realized with horror, directly at him. He froze in the middle of the field with the jug of water in his hand. absolutely certain that his 2 years of work were about to come apart. The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then she waved. It was not a friendly wave. It was the kind of wave that said, "I see you, and I want you to know I see you." Then she got back in her truck and drove away. Marcus did not sleep that night. He sat in the cold weather nest, fully dressed, boots on, duffel bag packed, waiting for the sound of a sheriff's car coming down the dirt road. But no car came. Not that night, not the next day, not the day after that. A full week passed. Marcus started to believe, cautiously, that maybe the woman had decided he was not worth the trouble. Maybe she had seen a man hauling water from a creek and assumed he was a hunter, a trespasser, a drifter, but not anyone worth calling the police about. Maybe, he thought, she had even felt sorry for him. He never saw her again, but he became more careful after that. He only went to the creek at dawn and dusk. He wore dark clothes. He walked in the tree line instead of crossing the open field. And the barn stayed his secret. Marcus lived in that barn for 1 year and 10 months. In that time, he saved nearly every dollar he earned doing occasional day labor in the town 3 miles away. He worked under the table, unloading trucks, clearing brush, and helping an old man rebuild a fence. He ate simple food, mostly rice and beans, and whatever he could forage or buy cheap. He read every book he could get his hands on at the town library, which let him in without asking for an address because the librarian, a woman named Carol, decided not to ask questions. By the time he left the barn, Marcus had saved almost $4,000 in cash, wrapped in a plastic bag and buried under a stone in the corner of his nest. He used that money to put down a deposit on a small rental room in the town, get an ID, and start applying for real work again. Within 6 months of leaving the barn, he had a full-time job at a lumber yard. Within a year, he had his own apartment. Marcus is doing okay now. Not rich, not comfortable, but housed and working and stable. He told his story to a local newspaper reporter in 2024, which is how most of these details became public. When the reporter asked him why he had shared it after keeping it secret for so long, Marcus said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. He said that the barn had taught him something he wished more people understood. It had taught him that the difference between having nothing and having a home was not money. It was imagination and patience and the willingness to see what was already there. The barn, by the way, is still standing. The property was eventually sold, years after Marcus left, to a family who plans to tear it down and build a house on the land. Marcus asked the reporter not to print the exact location, and the reporter agreed. Somewhere in rural Georgia, there is a collapsing barn in a forgotten field, and inside it, if you knew where to look, there is still a hidden nest in the far corner, a bed of dried hay, a wooden crate with a paperback book on it, a small, quiet monument to what one man built when he had nothing left but his hands, and $92. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. We tell stories every week about people who built extraordinary lives out of the places and the materials everyone else walked past. Thanks for watching. And the next time you drive past an old barn in an empty field, take a second look. You never know what might be inside.